Indeed, you're watching Good Morning Kenya. My name is Mike Migwe. Thank you for staying with us. Now from politics, we shift gears and talk about matters water regulatory reforms. And in studio, I'm joined by CEO Richard Cheruyot, who is the CEO of Water Services Regulatory Board, that is WASREB. Welcome to the program.
Asante.
Thank you for making time. Let's get directly into it. For a person who is hearing about WASREB for the first time, what is it and what's its mandate?
Thank you very much, Mike, for this, and thank you for having us in studio this morning. Just to speak about issues of regulation, and just to also talk about our journey that has been there for the last 20 years. When you talk about the Water Services Regulatory Board, we're talking of that institution that is in charge of regulation of water services. And for us, water services is water and sanitation services. We are creation of the reforms, and like I said, we've been in existence for the last 20 years. Our mandate is basically to regulate water and sanitation services. We actually say we are the custodian of the right to water on behalf of the Kenyan citizens. You're aware that the Constitution under the Bill of Rights does guarantee the right to water and sanitation services, and we are that institution that basically ensures that that right is seen to be given, or is seen, or the actors that are there basically demonstrate that there's action towards realization of that right. So WASREB basically exists to ensure that that right is delivered and that right is safeguarded.
All right. How do you ensure that there is access to safe and safe water services, safe water and reliable water services to the people?
Like I said, when you look at the issue of regulation, you're basically saying you want to ensure that people have that right and have that right in the standards that have been prescribed in the Of course, when you talk about ensuring, then you start from where are we currently. So for us, the first thing that we look at is really ensuring that we have data in terms of where are we starting from and where do we want to go. So we have indication of where access is currently as we speak. But then the government has plans to ensure that, we have a national vision. And to support that vision, we have developed a national water and sanitation plan. That plan basically is the blueprint to taking us to where we want to go in terms of access. But then that plan alone, without really clear deliverables, cannot take us to where we want to go. So we have actors who are responsible for this. Of course, the way the Constitution is structured is that water and sanitation services is a shared function between the national government and the county governments. The national government basically being responsible for policy, regulation, both for water services and water resources, but then the county is being responsible for water services delivery. And I think increasingly as we talk about water services delivery, we're basically talking about water and sanitation services. So we have, you have the national standards, you have the plan, and that plan, by the way, the development of that plan was actually from what the counties felt were the things that needed to be done to be able to get us to the national vision. So it was actually developed from the bottom and upwards, and we have a national plan that now says if we implement this plan, then we will be able to get to our national targets in matters of water and sanitation services. But then the actors really, the duty bearers in terms of water and sanitation service provision are the county governments. The county governments are required by law to put in place vehicles that deliver these services on their behalf. And these vehicles are called the water service providers. So we have the water service providers whose mandate now on behalf of the county governments is to deliver this service. And in that mandate of the water service providers, the license that they have been issued with has clear targets to now ensure that for the areas that have been given, they demonstrate or they are progressively improving on access. And when you issue a license to a water service provider, that license has clear targets annually for the period of the license for them to deliver in terms of access levels.
So that touches on the issues of enforcing compliance, especially for water service providers.
Yeah. Actually, Mike, when we talk about licensing, then you're basically saying, it has obligations, but again, it has, you have the obligations to deliver as a water service provider. So we agree that these are the targets that you have to deliver as a water service provider. In the event that you don't deliver on those targets, what are then the sanctions that come in? But the way we approach this is really, we have agreed, we discuss and agree on these targets with the water service providers, and they, they commit to targets that actually are reasonable, and they are quite sure that with the resources that they have, then they can be able to deliver on those targets. But again, the national government has a role to play in terms of improving access. So we have, in terms of the institutional framework that we have entities that we call waterworks development agencies, whose role is really basically to develop assets and hand over those assets, if they are within the specific counties, to the water service providers for operations. But the law has now been amended to say that if those counties are cutting across more than one county, then the waterworks development agency basically then operate those waterworks and deliver those and sell this water in bulk to the respective water service providers in the different counties. So in that architecture, then you're basically saying you collaborate both as a national government and the county government to be able to deliver on access to water services.
Yes. Speaking of access to safe and affordable water services, what is the status of water supply in the country, and are there ongoing efforts to improve it?
If we talk about the status of water services in the country, I think as part of the mandate that we have is to report annually to the public in terms of water and sanitation services. And we have done this. I said the journey for WASREB began in the last 20 years. Annually, we produce a report that looks at what is, really the level of access nationally. The last report we did was for 2023-2024. And that looked at, what are the levels of access. We currently have, water service providers that cover about 55% of the national population. And access in the areas of this, what we would actually call regulated water service providers, is about 65%. We are in the process. If you look at the plan that we have as WASREB, we're in the process of now looking at the other 45% of the population. How does it look like? These are places where, you have rural systems, you have what we would actually be calling small-scale service providers. So what we're looking at currently is now to map out all these systems, which we have really done, and trying to look at what is their contribution to the national access. So we have nationally access of levels of 65%. If you look back, the national targets as of 2015 was supposed to be at 80% in the urban areas. And since most of these water service providers are in the urban areas, then you're basically saying we are falling short by about 15 percentage points if you look at the targets that we had. But the plan that I referred to, because then you asked me about where do we stand and what are the plans. When we developed the National Water and Sanitation Plan, it was basically to look at where are we currently and where can we get in the next 5 years for now, because the National Water and Sanitation Plan is taking us to 2030, which nationally and globally we're supposed to have universal access to water services. So this is the plan, and this is where we are in terms of access, and the plan is to drive us to get to this. The critical point as we look at this is really to ensure that we adhere to the plan and put resources to be able to drive us to the commitments that we have in the plan. Yes.
As the CEO of this body, what can you say has been the biggest challenge in ensuring that there is universal access to clean water?
I think one is we need, like if you look at the amount of resources that we require. When we did that plan, when the national government did the plan, we're talking of about 995 billion Kenya shillings for the next 5 years. Of course, the plan was done in 2023, so that was supposed to be in the next 7 years. That is quite a huge amount of resources that is required. The way, Mike, we financed water services in this country for the last 20 years, and that was the whole essence of the reform process, was actually through what we call actually 3 T's. Although now people talk about the 4th one, but the 3 T's are basically from taxes, from transfers, from the tariff, and then increasingly now towards trade. Appreciating that as a country we're moving from a low income to a low medium income country. So we're moving to the 4th T. The whole essence of the reform process was really incrementally focused on the T, that is the tariff. Because if you look at government financing this, that is quite huge. It's about 1 trillion shillings. The current budget that we had is that we have currently is about 4 trillion. So basically set aside 25% of the national budget towards water services. It may be too ambitious. So I think what we need to do is really look at these other 3 T's. We have made quite some good strides looking at the tariff in terms of the contribution of the tariff to financing water services. I think what we are seeing, there's been a bit of a challenge in the last few months where we've seen a bit of resistance to the tariff, which for me doesn't augur well for the sector because it has the potential to really glow back on the gains that we have realized. It's not to say that the tariff is not affordable, but I think it's generally just about resistance and attributed also to the high cost of living that we are seeing. We need to focus on financing through revenues that the water service providers generate. Then, of course, government can complement through taxes, and in the plan, in the National Water and Sanitation Plan, which we actually call NAWASIP, that contribution from each of the actors has actually been mapped out. In fact, we are moving now to looking at contribution of the private sector, and that's why when you talk about the amendments that were done in the Water Act recently, the focus was really to look at what is the place of public-private partnerships in financing of water and sanitation services. So I think it's clear, the plan is clear, it's for all the actors in this space to be able to do what they're supposed to do.
And also, do these tariffs, speaking of tariffs, do they vary across different places or different counties?
Before the reforms, that was like 20 years ago, which is the journey that I was telling you. We used to have uniform tariffs across the country. Those uniform tariffs never used to have regard for the cost of service. You appreciate, of course, that we are not paying for the commodity that is water, but we are paying for the cost of providing that water from wherever it's gotten from to your doorstep. That cost of service varies from one place to the other. If you talk about the different countries, the different places in this country, if you talk of Nairobi, for example, and luckily, by the way, in most of the cities, now we have 5 cities. All these 5 cities, their water supplies come from outside those counties. So the way we've structured the tariffs and the whole essence of the reform process was to really say, can we have differentiated tariffs so that then the tariffs address the cost of being able to provide that service. So we have differentiated tariffs that looks at the cost of providing that service in the different places. So they vary from one place to the other, depending on what is the cost of providing that service. But again, speaking of the issue of, we've said this is the right. And that right must be seen to be enjoyed, But then it must also be seen that there must be equity in service provision. So what happens is that nationally, we're saying you shouldn't spend more than 5% of your income on water and sanitation services. If that standard is surpassed, then what happens is that you call in for subsidies. Then you're saying, if we assess and say that the cost of water and sanitation services in a given place is more than 5% of a household income, and it's the average household income in a given place, then you would actually be saying the county government would come in to subsidize. So that then that water service becomes affordable. So indeed, you're right, the tariffs in different places are different. because the cost of service in the different places is different. Yeah.
And what are the steps of now ensuring that clean water remains affordable, especially to vulnerable groups?
Yeah. So like I've said, one of course is by clearly defining those national standards. We say you shouldn't spend. So we have an indication of what is the average household income. And that average household income should then be linked to how much a household should spend in water services.
Yeah.
But again, one of the critical principles, Mike, in setting tariffs is that, there should be fairness. And the way fairness is built in the tariff is that normally, what we would actually, the way we look at structuring of the tariff is that we've adopted an approach that says you pay more if you consume more. It's called an increasing block tariff. And that increasing block tariff has considered what you would actually call a lifeline tariff. A lifeline tariff is saying if on average, based on an average household, for example, of 5 people, each using about 50 liters of water per day, then you'd actually be saying you're using about 250 liters of water per day. Yeah. So that's like quarter of a cubic meter. If you multiply that by about 30 days, it basically gives you about 6 cubic meters. Yeah. So what happens is that that first 6 cubic meters is actually normally provided at lower than the average cost to ensure that it becomes affordable. If you are consuming more than the lifeline, if you're consuming, for example, as a person, more than 50 liters per person, 50 liters, then you pay more. So inbuilt within the tariff is what we actually call cross-subsidization. So the higher consumers actually pay higher than what you would actually say is the average cost. But again, the other consumers that are non-domestic would actually also be subsidizing the other domestic ones. You talk about if people using water for different purposes, that is not for domestic. If I'm using water for commercial purposes, if I'm using water for industrial purposes, then that person should actually subsidize that person who uses water for domestic purposes. Yeah, but so it ensures in that way, it ensures that then the water becomes affordable. But again, you appreciate that in very, in vulnerable places, the water may not be piped to your house. So you don't have the latitude of, saying you use 6 cubic meters. You fetch water from a domestic, from a communal water point. So if you're fetching water from a communal water point, what happens is that that rate has actually been almost subsidized, unless it's not possible to cross-subsidize from the other consumer categories. So what happens is that we've actually tried to standardize that. You look at a rate of about 2 shillings, 2 to 5 shillings for 20 liters. Yeah, it's still higher than what you would actually be paying if you're paying if you have supply access to the household, but then it is really to cushion again the vulnerable groups. And to ensure that that water becomes affordable, and we ensure that utilities, the water service providers, subsidize that cost, and to ensure that these vulnerable groups also have access. But moving away from a pricing approach, we've again push utilities to ensure that they provide access to these areas. Yeah. Because like I'm telling you, if you have access to the household, it's very likely to be cheaper than when you're getting it from a communal water point, leave alone the issue of convenience. Yeah. So what we're doing is in that assessment that we have for utilities, we have an indicator that we call PROPOA assessment. The PROPOA assessment looks at, what are the affirmative actions that water service providers are taking to ensure that these vulnerable groups have access to water services. And we've built in a number of aspects, including even the way the institution is governed. You see, if from our assessment, if more than 30% of your consumers are from what you would actually be calling low-income areas, then even in the board of the water company, there should be somebody sitting there to basically ensure that these interests of this group are safeguarded, and we assess that. So those are some of the interventions we are putting in place just to ensure that for these vulnerable communities, water becomes is affordable.
Are there collaborations with stakeholders to ensure that or to improve equitable access to water and sanitation?
Yes. Just like in the whole governance framework, the way we have built in the issue of public participation, every decision, be it by the water service providers, be it by WASREB, has to be supported by a very elaborate public consultation process. So that ensures that in the decision-making process of the water service providers, even for us as WASREB, that this input of the people we are serving is actually captured. But again, we push, or we have put in the requirements for the water service providers that in certain given time intervals, they actually undertake stakeholder engagements. Okay. That stakeholder engagement is actually supposed to capture what the stakeholder needs are and be able to then build in the plans that these utilities have to ensure that you're speaking to the issues that these guys are asking for and addressing the challenges that they are facing. Okay. So indeed, the whole issue of stakeholder engagement is very critical in all the decisions that we make in the whole value chain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there technological innovations that you're using in water regulation?
Yes. Both from a regulator perspective, but also from a service provision perspective. Let me start from water services provision. One of the biggest challenges that we face as a country is really the level of water losses. And that water loss is really because of, the kind of maybe meters we're using, the kind of maybe pipes we're using. And what we have done is really, work with the water service providers to improve on the efficiency of the kind of metering devices that we're using. We have cases where water service providers have actually been able to install smart meters. And smart meters are basically to assist them be able to, almost on a real-time basis, see how the water flow is. So if you have a whole area of a water service provider, you then demarcate that area into manageable units where you're able to see how much water you're pushing in and how much of that water is actually read by these other meters. Yes. It almost gives you a real-time assessment of how water is being managed. So that addresses the issue of water losses. Because as we speak about improving access, one of the biggest challenges we are facing is that we're losing almost 50% of even what we produce. It's almost stuck at, the last report that we did was 43%. The year before it was 45%. Yeah. So the improvement over time has actually been very marginal. We need to have very deliberate actions to actually ensure that we deal with water losses. But again, at the national level, we are having, adopting technology in different aspects. We want to, under our mandate of having a national database on water services. We have recently launched a system that we call Merge Data, and you can almost be able to see, nationally what are the access levels, what are the level of water losses in the different places. Yes. Yeah, and that even is updated on an almost real-time basis, depending on what comes up from the ground. Okay. So these are some of the things that we are putting in place to ensure that we improve efficiency of water services. I think I needed to mention that one of the things why, for example, pricing is why in certain cases the price of water is high is also because of the level of water losses. If you're losing 50% of what you produce, that means I have to recover the cost from 50% of what I sell. That makes it high. Compare that with when you're losing 25%. It has a very direct implication on pricing. So it's critical that utilities adopt technology, or the sector adopts technology to make the water affordable, but again to ensure that being a water scarce country, then we're even able to safeguard what we are getting and manage it properly.
All right.
Yeah.
That was our time. That was our time.
Okay.
And thank you for making time to come on Good Morning Kenya and talk about these regulation reforms. That is CEO Richard Cheruiyot, who is the head of Water Services Regulatory Board. That is WASREB, joining us here on Good Morning Kenya. We end this conversation here, but don't go too far. Good Morning Kenya continues shortly. And the question up next is, do women forgive and forget? Do women forgive and forget? Join Vivian Degwa up next with the next segment on Family Check. My name is Mike Megwe. Good morning.